in pursuit of the ghost of rationality itself. There was a passage he had read and repeated to himself so many times it survives intact. It begins, "In the temple of science are many mansions, and various indeed are they that dwell therein, and the motives that have led them there. Many take to science out of a joyful sense of superior intellectual power. Science is their own special sport, to which they look for vivid experience and the satisfaction of ambition. Many others are to be found in the temple who have offered the products of their brains on this altar for purely utilitarian purposes. Were an angel of the Lord to come and drive all the people belonging to these two categories out of the temple, it would be noticeably emptier, but there would still be some men of both present and past times left inside. If the types we have just expelled were the only types there were, the temple would never have existed any more than one can have a wood consisting of nothing but creepers. Those who have found favor with the angel are somewhat odd, uncommunicative, solitary fellows, really less like each other than the hosts of the rejected. What has brought them to the temple? No single answer will cover. Escape from everyday life, with its painful crudity and hopeless dreariness, from the fetters of one's own shifting desires. A finely tempered nature longs to escape from his noisy, cramped surroundings into the silence of the high mountains, where the eye ranges freely through the still pure air, and fondly traces out the restful contours apparently built for eternity. The formation of hypotheses is the most mysterious of all the categories of scientific method. Where they come from, no one knows. A person is sitting somewhere, minding his own business, and suddenly, flash! He understands something he didn't understand before. Until it's tested, the hypothesis isn't truth. For the tests aren't its source. Its source is somewhere else. Einstein had said, "Man tries to make for himself in the fashion that suits him best a simplified and intelligible picture of the world. He then tries to some extent to substitute this cosmos of his for the world of experience, and thus to overcome it. He makes this cosmos and its construction the pivot of his emotional life, in order to find in this way the peace and serenity which he cannot find in the narrow whirlpool of personal experience. The supreme task is to arrive at those universal elementary laws from which the cosmos can be built up by pure deduction. There is no logical path to these laws. Only intuition, resting on sympathetic understanding of experience, can reach them." Intuition? Sympathy? Strange words for the origin of scientific knowledge. A lesser scientist than Einstein might have said, "But scientific knowledge comes from nature. Nature provides the hypotheses." But Einstein understood that nature does not. Nature provides only experimental data. A lesser mind might then have said, "Well then, man provides the hypotheses." But Einstein denied this too. Nobody, he said, who has really gone into the matter will deny that in practice the world of phenomena uniquely determines the theoretical system, in spite of the fact that there is no theoretical bridge between phenomena and their theoretical principles. The break occurred when, as a result of laboratory experience, he became interested in hypotheses as entities in themselves. He had noticed again and again in his lab work that what might seem to be the hardest part of scientific work, thinking up the hypotheses, was invariably the easiest. The act of formally writing everything down precisely and clearly seemed to suggest them. As he was testing hypothesis number 1 by experimental method, a flood of other hypotheses would come to mind, and as he was testing these, some more came to mind, and as he was testing these, still more came to mind, until it became painfully evident that as he continued testing hypotheses and eliminating them, or confirming them, their number did not decrease. It actually increased as he went along. At first he found it amusing. He coined a law intended to have the humor of a Parkinson's law that the number of rational hypotheses that can explain any given phenomenon is infinite. It pleased him never to run out of hypotheses. Even when his experimental work seemed dead-end in every conceivable way, he knew that if he just sat down and muddled about it long enough, sure enough, another hypothesis would come along. And it always did. It was only months after he had coined the law that he began to have some doubts about the humor or benefits of it. If true, that law is not a minor flaw in scientific reasoning. The law is completely nihilistic. It is a catastrophic, logical disproof of the general validity of all scientific method. If the purpose of scientific method is to select from among a multitude of hypotheses, and if the number of hypotheses grows faster than experimental method can handle, then it is clear that all hypotheses can never be tested. If all hypotheses cannot be tested, then the results of any experiment are inconclusive and the entire scientific method falls short of its goal of establishing proven knowledge. About this, Einstein had said, "Evolution has shown that at any given moment, out of all conceivable constructions, a single one has always proved itself absolutely superior to the rest," and let it go at that. The phrase, "at any given moment," really shook him. Did Einstein really mean to state that truth was a function of time? To state that would annihilate the most basic presumption of all science. But there it was, the whole history of science, a clear story of continuously new and changing explanations of old facts. The time spans of permanence seemed completely random. He could see no order in them. Some scientific truths seemed to last for centuries, others for less than a year. Scientific truth was not dogma, good for eternity, but a temporal, quantitative entity that could be studied like anything else. He studied scientific truths, then became upset even more by the apparent cause of their temporal condition. It looked as though the time spans of scientific truths are an inverse function of the intensity of scientific effort. Thus, the scientific truths of the 20th century seem to have a much shorter lifespan than those of the last century because scientific activity is now much greater. If, in the next century, scientific activity increases tenfold, then the life expectancy of any scientific truth can be expected to drop to perhaps 1/10 as long as now. What shortens the lifespan of the existing truth is the volume of hypotheses offered to replace it. The more the hypotheses, the shorter the time span of the truth. And what seems to be causing the number of hypotheses to grow in recent decades seems to be nothing other than scientific method itself. The more you look, the more you see. Instead of selecting one truth from a multitude, you are increasing the multitude. What this means logically is that, as you try to move toward unchanging truth through the application of scientific method, you actually do not move toward it at all. You move away from it. It is your application of scientific method that is causing it to change. Was a phenomenon profoundly characteristic of the history of science, which has been swept under the carpet for years. The predicted results of scientific inquiry and the actual results of scientific inquiry are diametrically opposed here, and no one seems to pay too much attention to the fact. The purpose of scientific method is to select a single truth from among many hypothetical truths. That, more than anything else, is what science is all about. But historically, science has done exactly the opposite. Through multiplication upon multiplication of facts, information, theories, and hypotheses, it is science itself that is leading mankind from single absolute truths to multiple, indeterminate, relative ones. The major producer of the social chaos, the indeterminacy of thought and values that rational knowledge is supposed to eliminate, is none other than science itself. Our current modes of rationality are not moving society forward into a better world. They are taking it further and further from that better world. Since the Renaissance, these modes have worked. As long as the need for food, clothing, and shelter is dominant, they will continue to work. But now that for huge masses of people, these needs no longer overwhelm everything else, the whole structure of reason, handed down to us from ancient times, is no longer adequate. It begins to be seen for what it really is, emotionally hollow, aesthetically meaningless, and spiritually empty. That, today, is where it is at, and will continue to be at for a long time to come. The train of his abstractions became so long and so involved, he had to have the surroundings of silence and space here to hold it straight. It was as though hours of constructions would have been shattered by the least distraction of other thought or other duty. It wasn't like other people's thinking, even then, before his insanity. It was at a level at which everything shifts and changes, at which institutional values and verities are gone, and there is nothing but one's own spirit to keep one going. His early failure had released him from any felt obligation to think along institutional lines, and his thoughts were already independent to a degree few people are familiar with. He felt that institutions such as schools, churches, governments, and political organizations of every sort all tended to direct thought for ends other than truth, for the perpetuation of their own functions, or for the control of individuals in the service of these functions. He came to see his early failure as a lucky break, an accidental escape from a trap that had been set for him, and he was very trap-wary about institutional truths for the remainder of his time. I want to talk about another kind of high country now in the world of thought, which in some ways, for me at least, seems to parallel or produce feelings similar to this, and call it the high country of the mind. If all of human knowledge, everything that's known, is believed to be an enormous hierarchic structure, then the high country of the mind is found at the uppermost reaches of this structure, in the most general, the most abstract considerations of all. Few people travel here. There's no real profit to be made from wandering through it. Yet, like this high country of the material world all around us, it has its own austere beauty, that to some people make the hardships of traveling through it seem worthwhile. In the high country of the mind, one has to become adjusted to the thinner air of uncertainty, and to the enormous magnitude of questions asked, and to the answers proposed to these questions. The sweep goes on and on and on, so obviously much further than the mind can grasp, one hesitates even to go near for fear of getting lost in them and never finding one's way out. What is the truth, and how do you know it when you have it? How do we really know anything? Is there an I, a soul, which knows? Or is this soul merely cells coordinating senses? Is reality basically changing, or is it fixed and permanent? When it's said that something means something, what's meant by that? Many trails through these high ranges have been made and forgotten since the beginning of time, and although the answers brought back from these trails have claimed permanence and universality for themselves, civilizations have varied in the trails they have chosen, and we have many different answers to the same question, all of which can be thought of as true within their own context. Even within a single civilization, old trails are constantly closed and new ones opened up. It's sometimes argued that there's no real progress, that a civilization that kills multitudes in mass warfare, that pollutes the land and oceans with ever larger quantities of debris, that destroys the dignity of individuals by subjecting them to a forced mechanized existence, can hardly be called an advance over the simpler hunting and gathering and agricultural existence of prehistoric times. But this argument, though romantically appealing, doesn't hold up. The primitive tribes permitted far less individual freedom than does modern society. Ancient wars were committed with far less moral justification than modern ones. A technology that produces debris can find, and is finding, ways of disposing of it without ecological upset. And the schoolbook pictures of primitive man sometimes omit some of the detractions of his primitive life. The pain, the disease, famine, the hard labor needed just to stay alive. From that agony of bare existence to modern life can be soberly described only as upward progress, and the sole agent for this progress is quite clearly reason itself. One can see how both the informal and formal processes of hypothesis, experiment, conclusion, century after century, repeated with new material, have built up the hierarchies of thought which have eliminated most of the enemies of primitive man. To some extent, the romantic condemnation of rationality stems from the very effectiveness of rationality in uplifting men from primitive conditions. It's such a powerful, all-dominating agent of civilized man, it's all but shut out everything else, and now dominates man himself. That's the source of the complaint. The first problem of empiricism, if empiricism is believed, concerns the nature of substance. If all our knowledge comes from sensory data, what exactly is this substance which is supposed to give off the sensory data itself? If you try to imagine what this substance is, apart from what is sensed, you'll find yourself thinking about nothing whatsoever. Since all knowledge comes from sensory impressions, and since there's no sensory impression of substance itself, it follows logically that there is no knowledge of substance. It's just something we imagine. It's entirely within our own minds. The idea that there's something out there giving off the properties we perceive is just another of those common-sense notions, similar to the common-sense notion children have, that the earth is flat and parallel lines never meet. Secondly, if one starts with the premise that all our knowledge comes to us through our senses, one must ask, from what sense data is our knowledge of causation received? In other words, what is the scientific, empirical basis of causation itself? Hume's answer is none. There's no evidence for causation in our sensations. Like substance, it's just something we imagine when one thing repeatedly follows another. It has no real existence in the world we observe. If one accepts the premise that all knowledge comes to us through our senses, Hume says, then one must logically conclude that both nature and nature's laws are creations of our own imagination. This idea, that the entire world is within one's own mind, could be dismissed as absurd if Hume had just thrown it out for speculation. But he was making it an airtight case. To throw out Hume's conclusions was necessary, but unfortunately he had arrived at them in such a way that it was seemingly impossible to throw them out without abandoning empirical reason itself and retiring into some medieval predecessor of empirical reason. This Kant would not do. Thus it was Hume, Kant said, who aroused me from my dogmatic slumbers and caused him to write what is now regarded as one of the greatest philosophical treatises ever written, The Critique of Pure Reason, often the subject of an entire university course. Kant is trying to save scientific empiricism from the consequences of its own self-devouring logic. He starts out at first along the path that Hume has set before him. That all our knowledge begins with experience, there can be no doubt, he says, but he soon departs from the path by denying that all components of knowledge come from the senses at the moment the sense data are received. But though all knowledge begins with experience, it doesn't follow that it arises out of experience. This seems at first as though he is picking nits, but he isn't. As a result of this difference, Kant skirts right around the abyss of solipsism that Hume's path leads to, and proceeds on an entirely new and different path of his own. Kant says there are aspects of reality which are not supplied immediately by the senses. These he calls a priori. An example of a priori knowledge is time. You don't see time. Neither do you hear it, smell it, taste it, or touch it. It isn't present in the sense data as they are received. Time is what Kant calls an intuition, which the mind must supply as it receives the sense data. The same is true of space. Unless we apply the concepts of space and time to the impressions we receive, the world is unintelligible, just a kaleidoscopic jumble of colors and patterns and noises and smells and pain and tastes without meaning. We sense objects in a certain way because of our application of a priori intuitions, such as space and time, but we do not create these objects out of our imagination, as pure philosophical idealists would maintain. The forms of space and time are applied to data as they are received from the object producing them. The a priori concepts have their origins in human nature so that they're neither caused by the sensed object, nor bring it into being, but provide a kind of screening function for what sense data will accept. Is a continuous synthesis of elements from a fixed hierarchy of a priori concepts and the ever-changing data of the senses.